There is a 1-year-old baby on television who built a laser gun, plotted the death of his mother, and announced plans to take over the entire planet. He meant every word of it. He was not doing a bit. He was not playing pretend. He was, by every measure the show could offer, the most dangerous character in the house. His name was Stewie Griffin, and Family Guy spent the next 25 years turning him into someone else entirely. Not all at once. Not in a single decision anyone could point to and say, that is where it happened. It happened in small steps, across cancellations and revivals and road trips and therapy sessions and sexuality jokes that never went anywhere. Each step made sense on its own. Together, they add up to one of the most complete character transformations in the history of animated television. Welcome to Red Umbrella. This is how Family Guy ruined Stewie Griffin, season by season. Let us begin. The original blueprint, seasons 1 to 3, 1999 to 2002. There is a moment in the very first episode of Family Guy where a 1-year-old baby stands in his crib, looks out at the world around him, and decides he wants to destroy it. Not in a cute way. Not in the way babies knock over cups or throw food on the floor. He wants to build weapons. He wants to kill his mother. He wants to take over the entire planet. And the show plays it completely straight. That baby is Stewie Griffin, and in 1999, he was one of the most original characters on television. What made Stewie work in those first 3 seasons had nothing to do with being funny in the way people usually think about cartoon babies being funny. He was not clumsy. He was not innocent. He was not confused about the world around him. He was the opposite of all of those things. Stewie Griffin, in seasons 1 through 3, was a full adult mind operating inside a body that could not reach the kitchen counter. He spoke like a professor. He planned like a general. He looked at his mother the way a chess player looks at a piece he needs to remove from the board. And the entire joke, the engine that made every Stewie scene in those early years actually land, was the gap between those two things. The mind of a villain, the body of an infant. That gap was everything. Seth MacFarlane built the character from scratch for the pilot pitch he made to Fox in 1998. He has talked about the idea in multiple interviews over the years. The concept started with a simple question. What if a baby had the full inner life of an adult, but nobody around him took that seriously? What if the most dangerous person in the house was the one everyone kept putting in a high chair? MacFarlane described the finished version of Stewie as an evil Rex Harrison, specifically pointing to Harrison's performance in the 1964 film My Fair Lady as the basis for the voice. That reference matters more than it might seem. Rex Harrison in that film played a man who was cold, precise, superior, and deeply convinced that everyone around him was beneath him. He spoke in a way that made everything sound like a verdict. That is exactly what Stewie sounded like in seasons 1 through 3. Every line he delivered felt like a judgment. The voice was only part of it. The writing for early Stewie was built around a vocabulary that most adults would have to look up. He called Lois his ovarian Bastille, meaning he saw her womb as a prison he had escaped from and now wanted revenge against. He referred to Peter, his father, simply as the fat man, with the tone of someone discussing an obstacle rather than a parent. When other characters were around, Stewie would say things like, "What is it that you children are into nowadays?" He was 1 year old saying this. That was the joke. Not the words themselves, but the complete disconnect between his age and his perspective. The show trusted viewers to hold both of those things in their head at the same time and find the space between them funny. His 2 goals in those early seasons were stated clearly and pursued seriously. He wanted to kill Lois, and he wanted to take over the world. Both of those things sound like the setup for a joke, and they were, but the execution was not comedic in the usual sense. Stewie did not stumble into his plans or accidentally cause chaos. He built weapons in his bedroom. He created a mind control device. He constructed a laser gun. He referred to Lois's constant interference in his scheming as the reason she had to be eliminated. He was not acting like a baby pretending to be a villain. He was acting like a villain who happened to be trapped in a baby's life, and he resented every second of it. The Family Guy pilot Death Has a Shadow aired on January 31st, 1999, right after the Super Bowl. From that very first episode, Stewie's evil was not treated as a background gag. It was structural. The show was built around the idea that this baby had real plans, real intelligence, and real hatred for the woman feeding him breakfast. Lois never understood this, which was part of what made it work. She would give him a hug while he was internally plotting her death. She would call him her little sweetie while he was thinking about which weapon to use on her. The obliviousness of the family around him made Stewie more dangerous feeling, not less. The first season episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, is where Stewie turns 1 year old, and the show treats his birthday with the same weight it gives to everything else in his storyline. Seriously, seriously from his perspective and as a genuine plot point. The episode involves a cult, a man Stewie believes is coming to return him to a dark place he came from before birth, and Stewie's increasingly frantic attempts to deal with the situation while also navigating his birthday party. It sounds absurd described out loud, and it is.
But the episode works because Stewie never winks at the camera. He believes all of it. He is operating with total conviction. That conviction was the foundation the character was built on, and it was what the later seasons would quietly pull out from underneath him. By season 2 and into season 3, the character had been established firmly enough that the show could do more interesting things with him. The matricide plots were still present and still central. The world domination plans were still ongoing, but the show was also starting to let other layers of Stewie come through. There were moments where his total seriousness about everything made him accidentally sympathetic, because you could see underneath all the plotting that he was still, inescapably, a baby. He still had a teddy bear named Rupert that he talked to like a best friend. He still got distracted by Teletubbies. He still needed Lois to do things for him that he could not do himself, which he found humiliating and which made his hatred of her feel almost logical from his perspective. She had power over him that he could not remove, and for a character whose entire identity was built on control, that was genuinely intolerable. The dynamic between Stewie and Lois in these early seasons was the engine of his character. She was not just a target, she was a symbol. She represented everything about his situation that he could not escape. She kept him fed and alive and dependent, which from Stewie's point of view was the same as keeping him trapped. His plans to kill her were not random cruelty. They were a character expressing the only kind of freedom available to him. The show understood this and played it that way. When Stewie failed to kill Lois, which he always did, the failure was not a punchline. It was a continuation of his ongoing war against his own helplessness. Wizard magazine in this period rated Stewie Griffin the 95th greatest villain of all time. Not the 95th greatest cartoon villain.
Not the 95th greatest animated character. The 95th greatest villain across all of fiction. That ranking tells you something about how the character was read in those years. He was taken seriously as a villain because the show took him seriously as a villain. Brian, the family dog, existed in these early seasons as someone who was at least partially aware of what Stewie was capable of. He could understand Stewie when he spoke, while the rest of the family mostly could not or chose not to respond to what he said. But their relationship in seasons 1 through 3 was not a friendship in any warm sense. Brian was wary of Stewie. Stewie was contemptuous of Brian. They occupied the same house and occasionally had scenes together, but the show did not position them as a unit. Stewie was a solo act. His relationship was with his plans, with Rupert, and with the ongoing mission to eliminate Lois and conquer the world. That was what he was for. The cancellation of Family Guy happened at the end of season 3 in 2002. The show had been struggling in the ratings for a while, and Fox pulled the plug. At the time, MacFarlane had been building towards something with Stewie. He has talked in interviews about a plan for season 3 to end with Stewie coming out after a near-death experience. The cancellation stopped that from happening. An episode called Queer is Stewie was actually produced but never aired. The character's development, whatever direction it was going to go, was interrupted before it could arrive anywhere. What survived from seasons 1 through 3 was a portrait of a character who was genuinely original, not because evil babies were new as a concept, but because of how completely the show committed to the premise. Stewie was not played for easy shock value. He was not a one-note joke about a baby saying bad things. He was a fully realized villain who happened to be 1 year old. And the show treated his villainy with the same consistency it would have given a live-action antagonist. That consistency was what made him memorable. That consistency was what people meant when they called him one of the best animated characters of his era. And that consistency was what the show would spend the next 2 decades slowly, quietly, piece by piece, taking away from him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened when the show came back from cancellation was not a simple continuation. It was something different, and Stewie would feel that difference more than any other character. The revival of Family Guy in 2005 brought the show back with higher ratings, a bigger budget, and a set of creative decisions that would reshape every character on screen. For most of them, those changes were gradual. For Stewie, they started almost immediately. And the first place those changes showed up was not in a big story moment, not in a 2-part episode, not in a major plot. They showed up in a road trip. Section 2, The Cancellation and the Shift, Season 4, 2005. Family Guy did not come back from cancellation the same show it was before. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but most people who talk about about the revival focus on what returned rather than what changed. They talk about the ratings. They talk about the fans celebrating. They talk about how rare it is for a show to come back at all. What they talk about less is the version of the show that came back, and how different it actually was from the version that got canceled. And nowhere is that difference more visible, more measurable, and more important than in what happened to Stewie Griffin. To understand the shift, you have to understand why the show came back in the first place. Family Guy was canceled by Fox in 2002 after 3 seasons. The ratings had not been strong enough to justify keeping it on, and the network moved on. What happened next was something nobody in television had really seen before. While the show was off the air, people started buying the DVDs. Not a few people, an enormous number of people. By the end of 2003, the Family Guy DVD sets had sold 2.2 million copies, making them the best-selling television DVDs of that entire year, the second highest selling ever at that point. Fox looked at those numbers and saw something they had missed when the show was actually airing. There was a massive audience for this program. It just had not been showing up in the traditional ratings the way the network expected it to. On May 20th, 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes. On May 1st, 2005, Family Guy returned to television. 11.85 million people watched that first episode back. For a show that had been off the air for 3 years, that was a statement. The audience had been waiting. The question that did not get asked loudly enough in all the celebration around the revival was, what exactly were they getting back? The answer, when you look at season 4 closely, is that they were getting back a version of the show that had been adjusted. Not gutted, not ruined overnight, adjusted. The core characters were still present. The humor was still dark and fast and willing to go places other shows would not. Peter was still Peter. Brian was still Brian. The show still looked and felt like Family Guy in the ways that mattered for a casual viewer. But underneath those surface similarities, decisions had been made about what the show was going to be and how it was going to work going forward. Some of those decisions were about structure, some were about tone, and some were specifically about Stewie. Seth MacFarlane has explained the shift in his own words across several interviews. His explanation, boiled down to its core, is this. The original version of Stewie, the pure villain, obsessed with killing Lois and taking over the world, had a ceiling. There was only so much you could do with a character whose entire identity was built around 2 goals that the show could never actually let him achieve. You could vary the plans, you could vary the weapons, you could vary the ways he failed, but the fundamental joke always resolved the same way. Stewie tried to kill Lois, Stewie did not kill Lois. Stewie tried to take over the world, Stewie did not take over the world. MacFarlane and the writers decided that if the character was going to survive for a long run, he needed more room to move. So they started giving him that room by changing what he was about. The direction they moved him in was toward his sexuality. MacFarlane told an interviewer at The Advocate, he originally began as a diabolical villain, but then we delved into the idea of his confused sexuality. We all feel that Stewie is almost certainly gay, and he is in the process of figuring it out for himself. We have not ever really locked into it because we get a lot of good jokes from both sides, but we treat him oftentimes as if we were writing a gay character. That quote is important not just for what it says about Stewie, but for what it says about the writing process. The writers were not developing Stewie's sexuality as a story. They were developing it as a source of jokes. The goal was not resolution. The goal was flexibility. If Stewie's sexuality was never pinned down, the writers could pull jokes from both directions indefinitely. It was a practical decision dressed up as a character choice. This had been building even before the cancellation. The unaired episode Queer is Stewie had been produced during the original run but never shown. MacFarlane had planned for season 3 to end with Stewie coming out of the closet following a near-death experience. The cancellation stopped that plan from ever airing. When the show came back, instead of completing that arc or abandoning it cleanly, the writers landed on a third option: keep it permanently open. Stewie would never fully come out, but he would also never fully not come out. He would exist in a permanent middle state that the show could mine for material whenever it needed to. That is what season 4 began building toward, and it is a structure that has never changed in any season since. What season 4 actually looks like, when you watch it, is a show in transition. Stewie is still recognizably the character from seasons 1 through 3 in a lot of ways. He still talks with his formal, elevated voice. He still refers to Peter as the fat man. He still has his bedroom full of weapons and gadgets. He still makes references to his plans for world domination and his desire to be rid of Lois. But those references are starting to feel different. In the first 3 seasons, the matricide plots were the point of Stewie's scenes. They were what his scenes were built around. In season 4, they start becoming the background of his scenes rather than the foreground. They become the thing the show gestures at to remind you who he is supposed to be, while the actual content of the scene is about something else. The animation itself changed in the revival. The post-2005 version of Family Family Guy has a cleaner, more polished visual style than the original run. Characters move more smoothly, the lines are sharper. In some ways, this is just the natural result of improved technology and a bigger budget, but it also affected how the characters felt. The rougher, slightly more unpredictable look of early Family Guy matched Stewie's energy in those first seasons. He felt dangerous, partly because everything felt a little dangerous in that version of the show. The cleaner, more settled visual style of the revival made the world feel safer, and Stewie inside that world started to feel safer too, even when the writing had not fully made that shift yet. The structure of the show changed more dramatically than almost anything else. The pre-cancellation Family Guy told stories, not complicated stories, not stories with a lot of emotional depth, but stories with beginnings and middles and ends where the characters wanted things and either got them or did not. The post-cancellation Family Guy became increasingly built around cutaway gags. These are the moments where the show cuts away from the main plot to show something unrelated, usually a quick joke that references a movie or a celebrity or a random situation, before cutting back to wherever the story was. This format became the dominant mode of Family Guy from season 4 onward, and it fundamentally changed how characters like Stewie were written. A character whose identity depended on sustained commitment to a goal does not work as well in a format built around interruption. The cutaway structure is allergic to consistency. It rewards the quick joke over the slow build. And Stewie's original identity was entirely a slow build. The Brian and Stewie friendship, which had been quietly developing since the Road to Rhode Island episode in season 2, took on more weight in season 4. Brian was the only character who fully understood Stewie, the only one who could have a real conversation with him, the only one who treated him as something other than a baby. As Stewie's villainy was slowly deprioritized, Brian became a more central figure in his storylines. The two of them together were good television. The chemistry between their characters was genuine, and the road to episodes that paired them on adventures were among the most popular things the show produced. But that popularity came with a consequence. The more the show leaned into the Stewie and Brian dynamic, the more Stewie's character was defined by that relationship, rather than by his own goals and identity. He stopped being a villain who happened to interact with Brian, and started becoming Brian's companion, who happened to have a villain's backstory. The ratings vindicated every decision the show made in the revival era. Season 4 performed well. The audience that had bought the DVDs showed up, and new viewers came with them. From a pure business standpoint, the return of Family Guy was an enormous success. This made it very difficult to argue against any of the creative decisions that accompanied it, because the numbers said those decisions were working. But ratings measure who is watching, not what is being lost. The audience that showed up for season 4 got a version of Stewie that was easier to like, easier to follow, and easier to pull a quick joke out of. What they did not get, and what many of them probably did not notice they were not getting, was the character who had made Wizard Magazine's list of the greatest villains in fiction. Something else disappeared in the transition that is easy to miss if you are not looking for it. In seasons 1 through 3, Stewie's plans failed because the world around him was indifferent to him, or accidentally in his way. Lois thwarted his schemes not because she was a hero stopping a villain, but because she was a mother doing ordinary things that happened to derail extraordinary evil. That dynamic made Stewie's situation genuinely interesting. He was not being defeated by someone stronger than him. He was being defeated by the mundane reality of being a baby in a house. In season 4, as his plans became less central, that dynamic disappeared. There was nothing left to be thwarted. The obstacles to Stewie's goals stopped mattering because the goals themselves stopped being the point. McFarlane has been honest, in the scattered interview quotes available across the years, that the evolution of Stewie was not one grand plan. It was a series of smaller decisions that accumulated over time. The shift away from the villain and toward the confused, flamboyant, funny companion was not something anyone sat down and designed from start to finish. It happened gradually, driven partly by what was getting laughs in the writer's room, partly by what the format of the show rewarded, and partly by a genuine belief that the character had more range than pure evil. Whether that belief was right or wrong is a fair argument. What is not a fair argument is whether the shift happened. It did. Season 4 is where it becomes visible, and it would only continue from there. The irony of the whole situation is that the show's popularity is what made the change possible, and probably what made it feel necessary. If Family Guy had come back to smaller audiences, the pressure to adjust the format and broaden the characters would have been lower, but it came back huge, and with huge audiences came the need to keep those audiences happy across a much longer run than the original 3 seasons. Keeping Stewie as a pure villain across 20+ seasons would have been very hard. Turning him into a flexible, sexuality sexuality ambiguous, Brian befriending, comedically useful character was much easier to sustain. The show chose sustainability. It always does. And Stewie paid the price for that choice in the currency of everything that originally made him matter. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 4 was not the moment Stewie was ruined. That is too simple and too sudden a way to describe what happened. Season 4 was the moment the direction was set. It was the moment the show's revival created the conditions under which the original Stewie could not survive unchanged. What followed over the next several seasons was a process, not an event. A slow dissolving of one character and a slow building of another in the same body, wearing the same outfit, still occasionally referencing the same old plans in a way that felt more like nostalgia than intention. And the part of that process most people remember, the part that gets pointed to as the real turning point, began not in a dramatic episode, but in a series of road trips with a dog. Section 3, Road to Rhode Island and the Birth of the Brian-Stewie Axis. Season 2, 2000, expanding through Season 5. There is a version of Family Guy where Stewie Griffin never becomes Brian's best friend, where the road trips never happen, where the two of them stay exactly what they were in Season 1, which is two characters who shared a house and occasionally insulted each other and had no particular reason to spend time together. In that version of the show, Stewie stays a villain. His relationship with Lois stays the engine of his character. His plans stay the point of every scene he is in. That version of the show was canceled in 2002. The version that replaced it was built, more than anything else, on a single episode that aired on May 30th, 2000, in the middle of Season 2, before the cancellation happened at all. Road to Rhode Island is a 22-minute episode about Brian going to pick Stewie up from his grandparents' house, and the two of them getting stranded and having to make their way back to Quahog together. That is the whole plot. By the standards of what Stewie was doing in most Season 1 and 2 episodes, it is almost nothing. There are no world domination plans, there is no elaborate weapon being built, there is no scheme against Lois. There is just a dog and a baby stuck together on a road trip, talking to each other, figuring out how to get home. And somehow, in the course of that simple premise, the show stumbled onto something it would spend the next 20 years building its best episodes around. The episode works because of what Brian and Stewie discovered about each other in that format. Brian, the family dog, was the only character in the show who treated Stewie as an intelligent person rather than as a baby making strange sounds. He could understand Stewie when he talked. He could argue back. He could push back on Stewie's ideas and actually present a counter-argument that Stewie had to take seriously. For Stewie,
who was surrounded at home by people who either ignored him entirely or treated him with the soft, patronizing warmth reserved for small children, Brian was something genuinely unusual. He was a peer, or as close to one as Stewie was going to get in that house. From Stewie's side, the appeal was obvious. A Quora analysis of the character, drawing on the logic built up across the show's early seasons, puts it this way. Before he and Brian became friends, Stewie had no outlet for his intelligence, and everyone around him treated him like a baby, despite him being significantly more intelligent than them. That frustration, the analysis continues, manifested itself in violence, in a desire to control the world, to make up for the lack of control in the rest of his life. However, as his relationship with Brian developed, he finally had a healthy outlet, which is why his violence and desire for world domination have also died down. That is not fan speculation. That is the logic the show itself built, episode by episode, across the years following Road to Rhode Island. The friendship was the explanation. The friendship was what the show offered in place of the villainy. You cannot have both at full strength at the same time, and the show made its choice. The Road to Rhode Island episode was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award in the Outstanding Animated Program category in 2000. That nomination matters because it tells you how the television industry responded to this format. They were not rewarding the Stewie scenes where he built weapons and threatened Lois. They were rewarding the Stewie scenes where he and Brian traveled together, argued, and had something approaching a genuine conversation. The industry signal was clear, even if nobody framed it that way at the time. The Brian and Stewie road trip format was the prestige version of Family Guy. The villain format was the cult version. Over time, prestige wins. After Road to Rhode Island, the Road to series expanded slowly but steadily across the show's run. Road to Europe aired in Season 3 and sent Brian and Stewie to the wrong continent after Stewie became obsessed with a British children's television program called Jolly Farm Review. Road to Rupert aired in Season 5, the first Road to episode after the revival, and sent them to Aspen, Colorado after Brian accidentally sold Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert at a garage sale. That episode is particularly worth noting because of what it centers on. The
entire driving force of the plot is Stewie's attachment to Rupert. Not his plans for world domination, not his desire to kill Lois, his feelings about his teddy bear. This is not a small shift. In the original Stewie, Rupert was a confidant, a presence Stewie talked to in private, a reflection of the baby side he kept hidden beneath the villain exterior. By Road to Rupert, Rupert's importance to Stewie is the entire point of the episode. The hidden softness has become the main event. The Road to Rupert episode also contains one of the best musical sequences in the show's history, where Stewie dances alongside a digitally inserted Gene Kelly from the 1945 film Anchors Aweigh in a sequence called The Worry Song. This moment is telling in a different way. The original Stewie, the Rex Harrison villain of seasons 1 through 3, would not have had a musical dance sequence at the emotional center of his story. The original Stewie's scenes had tension and contempt, and the cold efficiency of someone who genuinely meant what he said. The dancing Stewie, the Stewie who mourns his lost teddy bear through a Gene Kelly routine, is a different character. He is charming and funny and easy to root for. He is also much, much less dangerous. Road to Germany came in season 7 and took Brian and Stewie back in time to 1939 Poland to rescue their neighbor Mort Goldman from the Nazi invasion.
Road to the Multiverse opened season 8 and is widely considered one of the best episodes the show ever produced. In that episode, Stewie reveals to Brian a remote control device that allows them to travel between parallel universes, and the two of them spend the episode jumping from one version of reality to another, each animated in a completely different visual style. The episode was watched by over 10 million people when it first aired, and won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Individual Achievement in Animation for the director's storyboard work. Road to the North Pole filled season 9. Roads to Vegas arrived in season 11. Road to India closed season 14. 8 Road to episodes across the show's run. That is, 8 major episodes, usually among the best reviewed of their respective seasons, built entirely around Stewie and Brian as a pair. No other character relationship in Family Guy has anything close to that level of dedicated episode real estate. Peter and Brian, who were the original central duo of the show, have no equivalent series. Peter and Lois, the married couple at the heart of the family, have no equivalent series. The Road to episodes became the flagship episodes of Family Guy, the ones critics pointed to, the ones fans listed as their favorites, the ones that got award nominations, and every single one of them was built around the premise that Stewie and Brian were the two most interesting characters in the show when they were together. This is the core of what happened to Stewie through this process. His relationship with Brian did not just add something to his character, it replaced something. The more central Brian became to Stewie's identity, the less central Lois became. And Lois, in those first 3 seasons, was not just a target. She was the reason Stewie existed as a character. His entire inner life was organized around his relationship with her, his hatred for her, his resentment of her power over him, his ongoing war against his own dependency. When Brian replaced Lois as Stewie's primary relationship, the show lost the dramatic engine that made Stewie matter in the first place. What it gained was something funnier, warmer, and much easier to sustain across a long run. The trade felt like a good deal at the time. It looks different when you see what was given up. Screen Rant's documented analysis of the show's history puts this plainly. At the beginning of Family Guy's run, the central duo was Peter and Brian, where Peter would do and say ridiculous things, and Brian would react as the dry voice of reason. However, as the show went on, the writers found that there was even more comedic potential in pairing Brian with diabolical baby Stewie. That word diabolical is doing a lot of work in that sentence. By the time Screen Rant was writing about the Brian-Stewie dynamic, Stewie had not been genuinely diabolical in years. The word was there because it was part of the mythology, part of the way people remembered the character, part of the branding, but the actual diabolical content had been quietly drained away and replaced with the road trip content, the musical number content, the adventures through time and space content. The label stayed, the substance it described was mostly gone. The bottle episode Brian and Stewie, which aired in season 8, is the most honest version of what the Brian-Stewie axis eventually became. In that episode, the two of them are locked in a bank vault together for an entire episode with nothing to do but talk. There are no cutaway gags. No other characters appear until the very end. It is just Brian and Stewie in a room, and what they do is reveal things about themselves that the show had never said out loud before. Stewie tells Brian that Brian gives his life purpose, and that maybe that is enough, because that is just about the greatest gift one friend can give another. Brian tells Stewie he loves him. The episode received an IMDb rating of 7.8 and divided fans sharply. Some found it the
most emotionally honest thing the show had ever done. Others found it tonally wrong for a comedy that was supposed to be irreverent and unpredictable. But both groups agreed on one thing. This did not feel like the Stewie from seasons 1 through 3. Not even close. A character whose identity was built on cold contempt for everyone around him had become, by season 8, a character whose primary emotional truth was that he needed his dog friend's companionship to feel like his life had meaning. That is not a small character evolution. That is a complete replacement of the character's emotional core. The original Stewie did not need anyone. He had Rupert, who was a teddy bear, and that was sufficient because Stewie did not want connection. He wanted control. He wanted victory. He wanted to eliminate the people who stood between him and those things. The Stewie who tells Brian that their friendship gives his life purpose has none of that left. He has warmth instead. He has vulnerability. He has the kind of emotional openness that makes a character easy to love and very hard to make genuinely threatening. The vocal media analysis of how Family Guy changed across its run makes a point that goes directly to this. At the beginning, the show was about a family of screw-ups who at the end of the day loved each other. The Brian-Stewie dynamic fit into that family structure easily. Two characters who bicker and insult each other and go on adventures together and ultimately care about each other deeply. It is a classic pairing. It works. It produces good television. The problem is that it is not what Stewie was built to be. He was built to be the element of the show that sat outside the family warmth. He was the character who did not love anyone, who found the whole concept of family warmth either beneath him or in the way of his actual goals. When the show brought him inside the warmth, gave him a best friend, gave him someone whose death in a later season would cause him to travel through time to undo it, the character was finished as a villain. He had become something else entirely. That later season death, which will have its full moment in this essay, is only possible because of what the Road 2 series built. Stewie could not have cared enough about Brian to undo his death if the Road 2 episodes had not spent years making their friendship the most important relationship in the show. The road trips created the emotional stakes. The emotional stakes then determined what stories the show could and could not tell about Stewie going forward. Once you have built a character around the idea that his friendship with Brian gives his life purpose, you have permanently closed the door on the version of that character who did not need purpose because he had a mission. The Road 2 episodes are some of the best things Family Guy ever made. That is not the argument against them. The argument is simpler and harder to dismiss. What they built was beautiful, and what they replaced was irreplaceable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the road trips were only part of the mechanism. The other part, the part that was happening quietly in the background of seasons 4 and 5, while the adventures got more elaborate and the musical numbers got better, was a different kind of change. One that had nothing to do with where Brian and Stewie were traveling, and everything to do with what the show was deciding Stewie was actually interested in. And that change would spend the next decade turning what was left of the villain into something the writers could use for jokes from any direction they wanted, without ever having to commit to anything at all. Section 4. The Sexuality gag replaces the villainy. Seasons 4 to 6, 2005 to 2007. There is a specific kind of joke that Family Guy learned to rely on in its post-revival years. It is the joke that never fully lands because it is never fully thrown. The setup is clear, the direction is obvious, but the punchline never arrives. Instead of a conclusion, you get a cut. Instead of a resolution, you get the next scene. The joke exists permanently in the middle, which means it can be used again next episode, and the episode after that, and the episode after that, forever, without ever wearing out, because it never actually goes anywhere. That is exactly what happened to Stewie's Sexuality from season 4 onward. It became the joke that replaced the villainy. And it worked, in the sense that it kept producing laughs. But it worked the way a treadmill works. A lot of movement, no destination. To understand what the sexuality thread replaced, you have to understand what the villainy thread actually was. The matricide and world domination plots were not just jokes, they were a premise. A premise gives a character something to want, something they're working toward, something the audience can measure their actions against. Stewie wanting to kill Lois meant that every scene with Lois was loaded with a specific kind of dramatic weight. Even when the scene was funny, even when nothing threatening was happening, the audience knew what Stewie was thinking underneath the surface. That knowledge gave his scene scenes a layer of meaning beyond whatever was literally happening. The premise was the engine. Without it, you need something else to drive the character. The show decided that something else was going to be the ongoing question of whether Stewie was gay. This had started before the cancellation. The Family Guy Wikipedia page documents that when the writers began to flesh out Stewie beyond being a pure villain in season 2,
they began exploring his sexuality through a series of individual gags. But it was after the revival that this thread became the primary thing the show was using Stewie for, rather than a secondary element running alongside his villain identity. McFarlane explained the thinking in his own words in an interview with The Advocate. He said, "He originally began as a diabolical villain, but then we delved into the idea of his confused sexuality. We all feel that Stewie is almost certainly gay, and he is in the process of figuring it out for himself. We have not ever really locked into it because we get a lot of good jokes from both sides, but we treat him oftentimes as if we were writing a gay character." Read that quote slowly, and the creative logic becomes very clear. The reason the show never locked in on Stewie's sexuality was not because they were being careful with the character, it was because locking it in would have ended the joke. If Stewie is definitely gay, you cannot do the jokes where he has crushes on girls. If Stewie is definitely straight, you cannot do the jokes where he flirts with male characters. The ambiguity was not a story choice, it was a writing strategy. Keep the question open, and you keep the material available from both directions. McFarlane was honest enough to say this directly. The show wanted the flexibility more than it wanted the story. The history of how this played out in specific episodes is well documented. In the season 3 episode Chick Cancer, the show hints that Stewie might be interested in boys. In the season 7 episode We Love You Conrad, more hints in the same direction. The season 8 bottle episode Brian and Stewie shows that Stewie's phone screensaver is a picture of a muscular man. In the episode Damn It Janet, Stewie falls in love with a girl named Janet, and McFarlane described that version of Stewie as a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. In season 3, McFarlane had planned for Stewie to come out of the closet after a near-death experience as the finale. That episode was written, it was produced, it existed. The cancellation of the show before that season finale aired meant the plan died before it could happen. The produced episode, titled Queer is Stewie, never aired. When the show came back in 2005, McFarlane made the decision not to resurrect that plan. Instead of letting Stewie come out or making a definitive statement about who he was attracted to, the show landed on permanent ambiguity as the official position. McFarlane later elaborated on this in a Playboy interview where he described Stewie as almost certainly gay. He would later walk that back, saying that as a cartoon character, Stewie could be neither straight nor gay. Both of those statements cannot be fully true at the same time. What they reveal, taken together, is that the show's official position on Stewie's sexuality was whatever position produced the most usable material at any given moment. The character's inner life was being managed as a resource rather than being developed as a story. The practical effect of this on Stewie's character across seasons 4, 5, and 6 was significant. His scenes increasingly became about the sexuality gag rather than about his villain identity. Episodes would put him in situations where his attraction to a male character would be implied, then not followed up on. Episodes would put him in situations where he showed interest in a female character, then treat that as a reversal of what was expected. The show knew what the audience assumed about Stewie, and it played with those assumptions constantly. That playing was funny. Some of it was very funny. But it was also quietly doing something to the character that was hard to notice in the moment. It was shrinking him. A villain has weight because of what he wants and what he is willing to do to get it. A character whose primary function is to be the subject of an ongoing will he or will he not joke has a very different kind of weight. The second version is lighter. It is easier to watch. It does not create the same kind of tension. It does not give every scene the same underground pressure that the matricide plots gave Stewie's early scenes. Stewie went from being a character whose inner life was organized around mission and purpose to being a character whose inner life was organized around a question the show had decided never to answer. He went from a predator to a punchline. A warm, likable, often genuinely funny punchline, but a punchline. The Family Guy Fanon Wiki's documentation of Stewie's homosexual tendencies across the series confirms this pattern across specific episodes. In Movin' Out, Brian's song from season 6, Stewie is written as gay. In Damn It Janet from season 5, he is written as straight. The show moves between these two positions episode by episode with no continuity and no intention of establishing continuity. The Family Guy Wiki's main Stewie page describes his sexual orientation as ambiguous,
and notes that continuous jokes during the series involve Stewie and homosexuality. The word continuous is the key one. The jokes are continuous, but the story is not. The gag keeps running, but it is not going anywhere. There is something worth noticing about what the sexuality thread does to Stewie's relationship with Lois specifically. In seasons 1 through 3, Lois was Stewie's primary antagonist. She was the person his entire identity was organized in opposition to. She was the obstacle. She was the target. She was, in a strange way, the most important person in his world, because she was the person he most wanted to destroy. When the sexuality gag became the primary engine of his character, that relationship changed. Lois became less important to Stewie because his scenes were no longer built around his hatred of her.
The hatred was still occasionally referenced, still occasionally showed up in a line of dialogue, but it was no longer the point. The point was whatever sexuality-adjacent joke the episode was building toward. Lois went from being Stewie's central relationship to being, for large stretches of seasons 4, 5, and 6, almost irrelevant to his storylines. This matters because the Stewie and Lois dynamic was one of the most genuinely original things in early Family Guy. A baby who hated his mother with the cold precision of a professional was strange and funny and slightly uncomfortable in exactly the right way. The discomfort was part of the value. The show was doing something that felt genuinely transgressive, pushing on something that cartoons were supposed to leave alone, which is the idea that a mother's love might not be returned by her child, that a baby might look at the person taking care of him and feel something very different from gratitude. When that dynamic faded, something specific and irreplaceable went with it. The sexuality gag also had an effect on how Stewie was written on a line-by-line level. The original Stewie spoke in a particular way. His dialogue was formal and precise and delivered with total confidence. He did not second-guess himself. He did not wonder about things. He assessed, decided, and acted. The sexuality thread introduced a different mode into his dialogue. Moments of uncertainty, moments of deflection, moments where he said one thing and clearly meant another. These moments were good for jokes, but they were not consistent with who the character was supposed to be. The original Stewie was certain about everything, except whether he could defeat Lois's interference. The post-revival Stewie was certain about almost nothing, and his uncertainty was played for comedy. The confidence that made him formidable had become the confusion that made him relatable. The TV Tropes character page for Stewie documents that in several episodes, such as Turkey Guys and Send In Stewie Please, Stewie appears to be on the verge of coming out of the closet when he is interrupted for comedic effect. The phrase interrupted for comedic effect is doing enormous work there. It means the show knows where the moment is going and deliberately stops it from getting there because the getting there is less useful than the almost getting there. Once Stewie comes out, that particular joke is over. As long as he never quite makes it, the joke keeps running. The show chose the joke over the story every time across every season for nearly 2 decades. That choice had a cost that accumulated slowly and became impossible to ignore when you laid all the seasons out in a row and watched what happened to the character across them. What the seasons from 4 through 6 show, when you watch them with the original Stewie in mind, is a character being gradually hollowed out and refilled with something lighter. The hard, cold, purposeful villain was expensive to write well. He required commitment. He required consistency. He required the show to actually mean something with him, rather than using him as a flexible resource. The sexually ambiguous, Brian-befriending, road-tripping, emotionally available Stewie of the revival era was much cheaper to write and much easier to sustain across a long run. The show made the economic choice. Not the wrong choice necessarily when you are thinking about how to keep a show on the air for 20-plus seasons, but a choice with consequences that the character absorbed entirely. By the end of season 6, the sexuality gag had been running for 2 full seasons of the revival without any forward movement. It had become so established as a permanent feature of the character that the show began making meta jokes about it. Episodes would reference the fact that Stewie's sexuality was an ongoing question without resolving it. The show was aware of its own loop and found ways to be funny about the loop without ever breaking out of it. That awareness is interesting, but also slightly sad when you think about what was in the place of that loop originally. A villain with actual plans, pursuing actual goals, in a war with his mother that the show took seriously because it understood that the best comedy lives right next to something real. The sexuality gag never resolved. It is still running. It is still the primary thing the show uses Stewie for when it is not using him for Brian Stewie adventures or science fiction plots involving time machines. It has been running for nearly 20 years. The question of whether Stewie is gay has been asked and not
not answered in more episodes than most television characters appear in at all. And in all of that time, across all of those jokes and near revelations and deflections and contradictions, the show never once asked a different question that would have been much more interesting. Not whether Stewie was gay, but whether the character who had once made a list of the greatest villains in fiction was ever going to get to be that character again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The answer to that question was being built in Season 6, in 2 specific episodes with very specific titles, and the way the show answered it would turn out to be the single most consequential decision made about Stewie Griffin in the entire run of Family Guy. Section 5, the simulation that ended everything. Stewie kills Lois / Lois kills Stewie. Season 6, 2007. There is a version of these 2 episodes that could have changed everything. A version where the show looked directly at what Stewie had been building toward for 6 seasons, let him actually do it, and dealt with the consequences in a real and permanent way. A version where the 100th episode of Family Guy meant something beyond a celebration of its own existence. That version would have been genuinely brave television. It would have required the writers to trust the character they had built and follow him where his logic had always been pointing. It would have required them to close a door they had left open for 6 years and see what was on the other side. That is not the version that aired. What aired on November 4th and November 11th, 2007, across 2 consecutive Sunday nights, was Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie, the 4th and 5th episodes of Season 6, and the 102nd and 103rd episodes of Family Guy overall. These 2 episodes were originally produced for the end of Season 5, which means the creative team had been sitting on them for a while before broadcasting them as a Season 6 event. They were marketed as the payoff to the show's longest-running thread. The things Stewie had been threatening to do since the pilot was finally going to happen. The question that had been sitting underneath every Stewie and Lois scene for 6 years was finally going to be answered. The setup of the first episode is built around a birthday celebration for Lois. Brian gives her cruise tickets, and she invites Peter to go with her, leaving Stewie behind because he is the baby, and babies do not go on cruises. Stewie is furious at being left out. Brian, in a moment that doubles as the show acknowledging its own history, points out to Stewie that he has never actually followed through on any of his threats against Lois. He has talked about killing her constantly. He has built weapons. He has made plans. He has never done it. Brian says this with the casual certainty of someone who has watched it happen over and over and no longer takes the threat seriously. Stewie hears this and decides in that moment that he is going to prove Brian wrong. What follows is genuinely tense in a way that Family Guy rarely managed. Stewie acquires a submachine gun, rents a speedboat, travels to the cruise ship, finds Lois on the deck, and shoots her repeatedly. She goes overboard into the ocean. The show cuts to 6 days later. Joe Swanson tells Peter that the search for Lois has been called off. She is presumed dead. A year passes. Peter begins dating other women. Stewie has apparently pulled it off. The thing he had been promising to do since the very first episode of the show had actually happened. IGN's Asan Hawk, in his review of the first episode, gave it a 9 out of 10 and described it as carefully crafted and well told, noting that it found an excellent balance between comedy and storytelling. The second episode, Lois Kills Stewie, received a 9.4 out of 10 from the same reviewer. These were among the highest scores IGN gave to any Family Guy episodes during that period. The audience was engaged. The critical response was positive. The show had done something that felt genuinely significant. The second episode escalates everything. Lois is revealed to be alive. She had been shot and gone overboard, but she was rescued by a merman and nursed back to health. She developed memory loss and wandered the country before eventually regaining her memory and returning to Quahog. When she walks into the courtroom where Peter is being tried for her murder, the reveal lands hard. Stewie, exposed, escapes and takes the family hostage. He kills Cleveland Brown when Cleveland wanders into the house without knowing what is happening. He forces Brian at gunpoint to drive him to CIA headquarters. He gains access to a government computer, takes control of the world's power grid, and becomes president of the world. He broadcasts his rules to the planet. The thing he had been planning since season 1 has happened. He has achieved world domination. He has killed his mother, or at least tried to. Both of his goals from the beginning of the show have been realized in the span of 2 episodes. And then Lois fights back. She arms herself from Stewie's own weapons collection and confronts him in the White House. They battle. Lois gains the upper hand. She is about to kill him, but she cannot bring herself to do it. She is his mother, and despite everything, she cannot kill her own baby. Stewie uses that hesitation to disarm her. He is about to win. And then Peter, who has been bumbling through the background of the entire 2-parter in classic Peter fashion, accidentally fires a gun and shoots Stewie in the
the head. Stewie dies. Not heroically, not meaningfully. He is killed by his own father by accident, in a moment that is played for absurdity rather than weight. The family mourns over Stewie's body. The moment has a strange gravity to it, and then the show does the thing. Brian walks in with postcards from Peter and Lois on the cruise, which is reportedly going well. He finds Stewie stepping out of a device in his room, and the reveal comes. None of it was real. Everything that happened across both episodes, all 2 hours of television, all the shooting and the year passing and the world domination and the battle in the White House and Stewie's death was a computer simulation. Stewie had built a program to show himself exactly what would happen if he followed through on his plan to kill Lois. The real Peter and Lois never went anywhere near a cruise. The real Stewie never shot anyone. It was all inside a machine. It was all a dream. The show acknowledges in the episode itself exactly what it just did. Stewie and Brian have a conversation about whether an external viewer of the simulation would feel cheated by this ending. Brian calls it something like a dream sequence. Stewie argues that a computer simulation is completely different from a dream. He says it would only feel like a big middle finger to the fans if it were an actual dream sequence. Then, as Stewie insists that at least the episode did not end in the middle of a sentence, the way the series finale of The Sopranos did, the screen cuts to black in the middle of his sentence. It is a joke about the joke. The show knew what it had done and made a punchline out of knowing. The Family Guy Fanon Wiki's documentation of Stewie's matricide attempts is direct about what this episode meant for the character going forward. The entry confirms that the matricide theme had gradually been dropped in later seasons, starting with its peak in the 2-part season 6 finale. It continues. Stewie tells Brian things did not work out so well for him in the simulation, and that his plans of matricide and world domination will have to wait. By season 9, the wiki confirms, the arc of Stewie trying to kill his mother was completely dropped, and the concept was only revived in brief mentions geared toward making a joke about how Stewie never does this anymore. That last part is worth sitting with. The show's eventual response to dropping Stewie's central premise was to make meta-jokes about the fact that it had been dropped. Rather than giving the character something new with the same weight, the show periodically winked at the audience about what used to be there. The matricide plots became a memory that characters occasionally referenced, the way you might reference something from your past that you had moved on from. Remember when I used to try to kill my mother? Those were the days. The original premise became a nostalgia item. The simulation ending is the single most consequential creative decision made about Stewie Griffin in the entire run of Family Guy. Before those 2 episodes, the matricide thread was still technically active. It had been deprioritized. The Road 2 series and the Sexuality gag had been pulling focus away from it for seasons, but it was still there. It was still the foundational premise of the character. Stewie was still, at least on paper, a baby who wanted to kill his mother. After those 2 episodes, that was over. The show had run the scenario to its conclusion inside a simulation, let Stewie see how it ended, and use the outcome of that simulation as the in-universe reason for him to stop. He tried, it failed. He decided to move on. What is most revealing about this ending is not the simulation itself, but what it says about what the show was willing to do with its characters. Family Guy has never been afraid of dark comedy. It has gone to places that made audiences genuinely uncomfortable for over 2 decades, but it was unwilling to permanently change its own status quo. The simulation ending allowed the show to have the story of Stewie finally acting on his plans without any of the permanent consequences that story would have required. Lois could not actually stay dead, because then the show would be a different show. Stewie could not actually achieve world domination, because then the show would be a different show. So the writers found a way to tell both of those stories while putting them inside a container where none of it counted. The drama without the stakes, the conclusion without the consequences. This is a pattern in long-running television, and Family Guy is far from the only show to do it. But it hits differently with Stewie, because his character had been built on the specific promise that his goals were real. He was not pretending to want to kill Lois. He was not play-acting world domination. He meant it. The entire 6 seasons of comedy that came from Stewie had been built on the foundation that underneath the jokes, there was a genuine villain who genuinely intended to do something. The simulation ending retroactively made all of that less real. If the show was always going to put the stakes inside a container where they did not count, then what was the premise worth? What did it mean that Stewie had been planning and plotting and threatening all that time if the one moment the show finally let him follow through was never actually real? The reviews were positive, the ratings were fine, the audience moved on to the next episode and the episode after that, but something had changed
changed that did not change back. The Family Guy Fanon Wiki documents that in the seasons following these episodes, Stewie still made occasional attempts on Lois in seasons 7 and 8, but by season 9, even those diminished attempts were gone. The premise was dead. It had been killed not by a dramatic story choice that honored what it had been, but by a trick ending that allowed the show to walk away from it while pretending it had given the audience what they wanted. The show did acknowledge something interesting in the immediate aftermath. In the season 9 episode, And Then There Were Fewer, when a character named Diane Simmons is about to murder Lois, Stewie shoots Diane with a sniper rifle from a distance to stop it. His line, which is documented across multiple episode wikis, is, "If anyone is going to take that woman down, it is going to be me." This moment is often pointed to as proof that Stewie still had his old character inside him after the simulation two-parter. But look at what it actually shows. Stewie is protecting Lois. He is using his skills and his weapons to keep her alive. He is still calling her that woman rather than her name, still maintaining the pose of contempt. But the action contradicts the pose entirely. He saves her. A character who genuinely wanted his mother dead would have let Diane Simmons finish the job. Stewie did not. By season 9, whatever was left of the original premise was operating as decoration over a fundamentally different character. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The bottle episode Brian and Stewie, which came in season 8, is the most honest portrait of who Stewie had become by this point. That episode, which we will examine in full detail in the next section, does something the two-parter never managed, despite its bigger stakes and more dramatic setup. It looks directly at Stewie, without a simulation and without a trick ending. It shows what is actually there. And what is there in season 8 is not a villain at all. What is there is something that the show had been quietly building in Stewie's place for years, without ever announcing that the building was happening. Something warmer, sadder, and far more dependent on the dog who had gradually become the center of his world. Section 6. Brian and Stewie. The show reaches for depth and retreats. Season 8, 2010. There is an episode of Family Guy that almost nobody talks about when they list their favorite episodes, but that almost everybody who has seen it remembers. It aired on November 21st, 2010, in season 8. It is called Brian and Stewie. The premise is simple to the point of being almost nothing. Brian and Stewie get locked inside a bank vault together over a holiday weekend with no way out, no other characters, no cutaway gags, and nowhere to go. For 22 minutes, it is just the two of them in a room, talking. That is the whole episode. Two characters, one room, no interruptions. The reason this episode matters so much for understanding what happened to Stewie Griffin is not what happens in it, although what happens in it is genuinely surprising for a show like Family Guy. The reason it matters is what it reveals. Not what the writers chose to put into it, but what was already there, underneath the character, waiting to be looked at directly. When you strip away the cutaway gags, and the adventure plots, and the time machines, and the musical numbers, and give Stewie nothing to do except talk honestly to the only person he actually trusts, what you find is not a villain. What you find is a lonely child who has built an entire personality to keep people from getting close to him, and who is terrified that without Brian, his life does not mean anything. Seth MacFarlane voiced both characters in this episode. The entire episode is him talking to himself. That fact has been confirmed and documented across multiple sources, including IMDb's episode page. No other actors with speaking roles appear. The usual Family Guy ensemble, Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Quagmire, Joe, all of them are absent. The show committed fully to the experiment. Just the two characters, just the two voices, just the relationship that the post-revival seasons had been building as the emotional center of the show. What happens in the episode is a series of honest conversations, broken up by some dark comedy that is more uncomfortable than funny. Brian reveals that he carries a gun because he thinks about killing himself. Stewie discovers this and does not play it for a joke. He takes it seriously. He keeps Brian talking. The episode earns that moment because it has been building to the idea that these two characters know each other better than anyone else in the show knows either of them. Brian is the only one who understands what Stewie actually is. Stewie is the only one who pays close enough attention to Brian to notice that he is struggling. The emotional peak of the episode comes near the end. Stewie tells Brian, "You give my life purpose." And maybe that is enough, because that is just about the greatest gift one friend can give another. Brian tells Stewie he loves him. These lines are documented on the episode's IMDb page and have been quoted across multiple fan analyses of the show. The scene is not played for laughs. It is played straight, with genuine warmth, in a show that had built its entire entire identity on never playing anything straight for too long. IMDb user reviews of this episode are divided in a way that tells you exactly what the episode was doing. Some reviewers called it the greatest Family Guy episode ever made, the most emotionally honest thing the show had produced, and probably the last episode to show genuine emotion since season 3's Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows. Others found it wrong for the show, tonally out of place, uncomfortable in ways that did not feel productive. The IMDb score settled at 7.8, which for Family Guy is solid but not exceptional. The most watched and most celebrated episodes of the show score higher. The most experimental and honest one sits in the middle of the pack. What both camps of viewers agreed on, reading across the reviews, is that this did not feel like the Stewie from seasons 1 through 3. The disagreement was about whether that was a good thing. The people who loved the episode loved it because it showed Stewie as a real character with real feelings and real vulnerability. The people who disliked it were bothered by the same thing because that was not what Stewie was supposed to be. He was supposed to be the baby who felt nothing toward anyone except contempt and strategic calculation. The episode proved that version of him was gone. Whether you mourned that or celebrated it depended on which version of the character you had connected with. One IMDb reviewer, in a quote that has been referenced in fan discussions of the episode, wrote that McFarlane created this episode to show how manipulative Stewie Griffin really is, and that it also shows that Brian's depression is something more real than any viewer had expected, with previous episodes cracking jokes about issues Brian had with his life. That reading of the episode, Stewie as fundamentally manipulative even in his most vulnerable moments, is interesting because it tries to hold on to something of the original character inside the new context. But even that reading requires accepting that Stewie's primary relationship is with Brian, that his emotional world revolves around their friendship, and that without Brian, he would be lost.
None of those things were true of the Stewie from seasons 1 through 3. The original Stewie was not lost without anyone. He was self-contained. He had his plans and his weapons and his mission and Rupert the teddy bear, and those things were enough because he had organized his entire existence around purpose rather than connection. The Stewie of Brian and Stewie has none of that self-containment left. He is vulnerable in ways the original character would have found unacceptable. He needs Brian. He says so directly. He says it in a way that is clearly meant to be moving rather than pathetic. And it is moving, because the show has spent enough time building this relationship that the emotion feels earned. But earning that emotion required dismantling the architecture of a completely different kind of character. The retreat from the episode's honesty is the part that gets talked about least. Screen Rant's review of Brian and Stewie makes this observation directly. While it is a strong episode in isolation, it is too bad none of the revelations from this episode will likely carry on to future episodes. That prediction turned out to be exactly right. The gun Brian carries, the suicidal thoughts, the confession that Stewie gives his life purpose, the acknowledgement that their friendship is the emotional center of both their worlds. None of it carried forward in any meaningful way into subsequent episodes. The next episode after Brian and Stewie returned to the normal format of the show, as if the bottle episode had never happened. Characters were back to their usual modes. The emotional honesty was sealed off and left behind. This is one of Family Guy's most consistent patterns across its long run, and it affects Stewie more than any other character. The show reaches towards something real, something that would require actually changing the character, or the relationship, or the status of the world they live in, and then it pulls back. Not because the reach was wrong. The reach in Brian and Stewie produced one of the most genuinely affecting episodes the show ever made. The pullback happened because Family Guy is structurally built around resetting. Every episode ends with the world roughly where it started. Consequences that stick would require the show to be a different kind of program. So the show reaches and retreats, and the character absorbs the reach without absorbing the change. What Brian and Stewie accidentally documented, without intending to and without the show ever acknowledging it directly, was the full distance Stewie had traveled from his starting point. If you took a clip of Season 1 Stewie threatening Lois with a weapon and put it next to a clip of Season 8 Stewie telling Brian that their friendship gives his life purpose, you would be looking at two completely different characters who happen to share a name and a face and a voice. The transformation between those two moments was not announced. It was not the subject of a story. It happened in the background, episode by episode, as the show made small decisions that accumulated into a large change. Brian and Stewie is the episode where that change became impossible to ignore, because the episode stripped away everything else and showed you exactly who Stewie had become. He had become someone who needed to be loved. The original Stewie needed nothing of the sort. He needed victory. He needed control.
control. He needed his mother out of his way. Need, for the original character, was a weakness to be overcome rather than a feeling to be honored. The Brian and Stewie episode treated Stewie's need for connection as the most human thing about him, the part that made him worth caring about. That is a complete reversal of the original premise. And once the show had made that reversal visible, once it had shown you clearly that this was what Stewie was now, there was no going back. The villain was gone. The lonely child who needed his dog friend was what remained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next transformation waiting for Stewie would not come in a dramatic two-parter or a bottle episode that stripped away the usual format. It would come in something smaller and more specific, something that had been building quietly since the revival, and that most viewers had absorbed without fully noticing. It had to do with how Stewie sounded. Not the British accent, though that would eventually have its own moment. It had to do with what his words were actually doing, and how much of what made him original was tied up in the specific way he used language, and what happened to the character when that way of speaking quietly disappeared. Section 7. The vocabulary collapse. Stewie's voice becomes everyone else's. Seasons 7 to 12. There is a specific kind of comedy that only works if the person doing it fully believes what they are saying. Not believes it as a performance, believes it the way someone believes the sky is blue, without question, without awareness that anyone might see it differently. The original Stewie Griffin had that quality in abundance. When he called Lois his ovarian Bastille, he was not trying to be funny. He was describing his situation accurately, from his own perspective, in the most precise language available to him. The joke lived in the gap between how seriously he meant it and how absurd it sounded coming from a baby. Remove the seriousness and the gap closes. Remove the gap and the joke stops working. That is what happened to Stewie's vocabulary across seasons 7 through 12, and it happened so gradually that most viewers absorbed the change without registering it as a loss. The original Stewie spoke in a way that was documented and noted by critics and fans from the very beginning of the show. He used long, formal words in situations that did not call for them. He structured his sentences like a professor writing a paper, rather than like anyone having a conversation. He said things like, "What is it that you children are into nowadays?" while surrounded by people his own age. He referred to actions and people and situations with a level of clinical precision that made everything he said feel like a verdict rather than a comment. The TV tropes page for Stewie Griffin documents this trait under the label sesquipedalian loquaciousness, which is a formal way of saying the habit of using long and complicated words when shorter ones would do. The page notes that this was a defining trait of early Stewie, and that it was explicitly referenced in the show itself, in the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, where Brian looks at an earlier version of Stewie and says, "Geez, what, did you carry a thesaurus around with you?" That line from Brian is the show acknowledging the change. It is the writers in season 10 looking back at the season 1 version of the character and noting the difference through Brian's eyes. The season 1 Stewie carried a thesaurus around with him, metaphorically speaking. The season 10 Stewie did not. The line is framed as a joke about how Stewie used to talk, which means the show understood that he no longer talked that way. It just never explained why, never addressed it as a character choice, and never suggested it was a loss worth mourning. It was presented as a quirky observation about the old version of the character, and then the episode moved on. The villain's wiki entry on Stewie Griffin is one of the most direct sources on this specific change. The entry states plainly, Stewie also had an absurdly wide vocabulary in earlier seasons, and used huge words for situations that did not require them. In the present seasons, Stewie is far more laid back and flamboyant. Those two sentences are sitting right next to each other in the same entry, and the distance between what they describe is enormous. Laid back and flamboyant is not a smaller version of the original character, it is a different character. Laid back means relaxed, not urgent. The original Stewie was never relaxed. He was always operating with the focused energy of someone who had things to do and people to defeat. Flamboyant means showy and theatrical, in a way designed to get attention and laughs. The original Stewie was theatrical too, but his theatrics were in service of his mission, not in service of entertainment. The shift from one to the other is the shift from a villain to a performer. The TV tropes page for the Griffin family as a whole makes a broader observation that applies directly to Stewie. The page notes that Stewie becomes a lot more casual and less refined after losing any hints of being what it calls wicked cultured. The phrase wicked cultured is the way TV tropes describes a villain who has sophisticated tastes and manners alongside their evil qualities. Early Stewie was the definition of this. He appreciated art and music and literature. He quoted things. He had opinions about culture that he expressed with the contemptuous confidence of someone who had already decided that most people had terrible taste. That refinement was not separate from his villainy. It was part of it. It was part of the gap between what he was and what he looked like. A baby with the cultural opinions of a stern professor. When the refinement went, the gap narrowed. And as we have now established multiple times across this essay, the gap was the joke. What replaced the original vocabulary was not nothing. Stewie in seasons 7 through 12 is still funny. He still gets good lines. He still delivers them with McFarlane's voice doing interesting things. But the lines are different in kind. They are quicker, more casual, more focused on the immediate comedic moment rather than on building the portrait of a specific and unusual kind of mind.
The words he chooses are the words anyone writing a funny character would choose. They are not the words a one-year-old evil genius with the bearing of a Victorian professor would choose. The specificity is gone. What replaced it is generic sharpness, which is still sharpness, but without the thing that made it original. The Screen Rant analysis of how Family Guy has changed across its seasons makes an observation that applies here. It documents the broader pattern of characters becoming caricatures of themselves across the show's long run. Peter becomes less of a bumbling but recognizable father figure and more of a pure force of chaos. Brian becomes less of a witty observer and more of a lecturing political mouthpiece. The changes to Stewie fit into this pattern, but with a twist. Most of the other characters became exaggerated versions of their original selves, more of what they already were, pushed further in the direction they were already going. Stewie went in a different direction entirely. He did not become more of the original Stewie. He became a different character who kept some of the surface elements, the voice, the name, the general setup of a baby acting like an adult, while the specific content of what made him original drained away. The vocal media analysis of the show's changes puts this in terms of the group dynamic rather than the individual character, but the conclusion applies directly to Stewie's vocabulary. It notes that the original character traits of the Griffins all worked together, but that over time they began to clash because the characters had drifted from their original functions. Stewie's original function required his specific vocabulary. He was the character who spoke like no one else in the house spoke, who used language as a weapon and a marker of his difference from the people around him. When his language became casual and relaxed and accessible, he lost the marker. He started sounding more like everyone else. And a character whose entire identity was built on being nothing like everyone else cannot absorb that change without becoming a different character. There is a specific episode worth naming in the context of this section, not because it is the moment the vocabulary collapsed, but because it captured the result of the collapse clearly. In Season 8's Road to the Multiverse, which aired in 2010 and received enormous critical praise and over 10 million viewers, Stewie is at his most inventive and his most entertaining. The episode is genuinely excellent, but the Stewie in it is casual and quick and playful in a way that has very little of the cold, formal precision of the original. He makes jokes. He reacts to things. He and Brian play off each other with the easy chemistry of two characters who know each other perfectly. The episode works beautifully on its own terms, but if you were watching Season 1 Stewie and then watching this Stewie back to back, you would be watching two different approaches to comedy coming from what is supposed to be the same character. The original Stewie did not do banter. Banter requires a kind of playful looseness, a willingness to be in the moment rather than executing a plan. The original Stewie was always executing a plan. His conversations were not exchanges of wit between equals. They were interactions he was controlling and steering toward outcomes he had already decided on. The casualness of post-revival Stewie, his willingness to just hang out and react and joke around, is incompatible with the mindset of someone whose every waking moment is oriented around killing his mother and taking over the world. A character with a real mission does not have time to be laid back. When Stewie became laid back, it confirmed that the mission was gone. What gets lost when a character's vocabulary changes is harder to see than what gets lost when their plot changes. The Simulation two-parter was a visible event. The sexuality thread replacing the villain identity was a documentable shift, but the vocabulary collapse happened in individual lines across dozens of episodes, in words chosen slightly differently, in sentences that were a little shorter and a little more immediate, and a little less like something you would need to look up. Nobody pointed to a specific episode and said, here is where Stewie stopped using the language of an evil genius and started using the language of a funny supporting character. It just happened, the way most slow changes happen, until one day someone put Season 1 and Season 10 side by side and noticed the gap had closed. The gap between the original Stewie and the Stewie of the middle seasons is not primarily a gap in how evil he is, or how often he threatens Lois, or whether he is pursuing world domination. Those things can be measured in plot. The deeper gap is in what kind of mind the show is presenting to the audience. The original mind was cold, formal, certain, precise, and organized around contempt for everything around it.
it. The later mind is warm, casual, uncertain, accessible, and organized around its relationship with a dog. Both can produce comedy. Only one of them was original. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The full picture of what Stewie had become by the end of this period, by seasons 11 and 12, was a character who was friendly, funny, emotionally available, sexually ambiguous, and an ongoing joke that had been running for nearly a decade, and deeply attached to Brian in a way that the show had built into the foundation of its best episodes. He was, by any reasonable measure, a more likable character than the one who had started the show. He was also barely recognizable as the same person, and the show was about to do something that made even the remaining threads of the original character harder to hold on to.
In a single episode in season 16 that looked directly at everything Stewie had been hiding and then let him hide it all over again. Section 8. Send in Stewie, please. The show looks directly at the damage. Season 16, 2018. There are episodes of television that exist outside the normal run of a show. They follow different rules. They use a different format. They feel like the writers stepped back from the weekly machine they had been running and decided, just for this 1 hour, to actually look at what they had built. Family Guy has had a few of those episodes across its long run. Brian and Stewie in season 8 was one. The episode that aired on March 18th, 2018, the 12th episode of season 16, titled Send in Stewie, Please, is another. It is, by almost every measure, the most honest episode of Family Guy ever made about who Stewie Griffin actually is. It is also, by the same measure, the episode that most clearly shows what the show had done to him, because what the episode finds, when it finally looks directly at the character without jokes or adventures or cutaway gags to hide behind, is a child who built a fake version of himself to survive, and who has been living inside that fake version for so long that he cannot imagine existing without it. The setup is simple. Stewie is sent to the office of his preschool's child psychologist, Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, after pushing a classmate named Tyler down a flight of stairs. Pritchfield is voiced by Sir Ian McKellen in one of the most notable guest performances the show has ever had. The episode takes place almost entirely inside Pritchfield's office. No other members of the Griffin family appear except Brian at the very end. There are no cutaway gags anywhere in the episode. The show committed to this format completely, and Fox aired the episode with limited commercial interruption so that the runtime of around 25 minutes could play without the rhythm being broken. It was the first time in Family Guy's history that an episode aired this way. Everything documented about this episode comes from confirmed sources. The Wikipedia page for the episode, the TV Tropes recap, the Newsweek report on it, the Daily Beast interview with writer Gary Janetti, and the TV Line interview with the writers are all in agreement on the core facts of what happens and what it means. The therapy session begins with small talk that Stewie tries to control. He is good at controlling conversations. He has had years of practice, but Pritchfield is not controllable in the usual way. Within a few minutes, Stewie does something he rarely does with anyone except Brian. He starts being honest. Not fully honest, not immediately, but moving in that direction in a way that the episode tracks carefully. He brings up his British accent, and Pritchfield says he cannot hear any difference between Stewie's voice and a normal voice. This bothers Stewie enormously. The accent is central to his identity. It is the first thing anyone notices about him. It is how he signals to the world that he is different from everyone around him, and the one person in the room with an actual British accent cannot detect it at all. The revelation that follows is the most significant piece of canon information added to Stewie's character since the show began. Stewie admits that his British accent is entirely fake. He has been putting it on since before the show started. His real voice, which he briefly demonstrates, sounds like a standard American voice from the Boston area where Quahog is set. It sounds, as Newsweek's report on the episode documents, like a higher-pitched version of Brian Griffin. McFarlane voicing both characters in his natural range makes them sound related in a way that feels meaningful. The Daily Beast interview with Gary Janetti, who wrote the episode, explains why the fake accent was chosen as the central reveal. Janetti said, "It felt truthful that somebody who did not feel like he fit in would create an artificial personality. To an extent, that is what Stewie has done. That explanation is important. The accent was not a quirk or a joke. It was armor. Stewie built it to protect himself from the world around him, to make himself feel different and superior when he actually felt small and out of place." The Newsweek report quotes Stewie's own words from the episode directly. "Everything about me is this carefully constructed persona designed to keep people at arm's length." Read that line and hold it next to who Stewie was supposed to be. The original Stewie did not
have a persona designed to keep people at arm's length. He did not need one. He had contempt for people, which is a different thing entirely. Contempt does not require protection. It does not involve fear of connection or worry about what happens if someone gets too close. Contempt looks at other people and finds them beneath concern. What Stewie reveals in Send in Stewie Please is not contempt. It is fear dressed up as contempt. He is not cold because he feels superior. He is cold because he is terrified of being seen and found ordinary. That is a genuinely interesting revelation about the character. The problem is that it is not consistent with who the character was built to be. The original Stewie, the season 1 through season 3 villain, was not afraid of being seen. He wanted to be seen as exactly what he was, which was dangerous. He announced his plans. He delivered speeches. He confronted Lois directly. He was not hiding from anything. He was pursuing something. The therapy episode's version of Stewie is hiding from everything. He has been hiding for years, behind an accent and a persona and a level of confidence that the episode reveals as performance rather than reality. These two versions of the same character cannot both be true at the same time.
The episode chose the newer version and presented it as the real one, which retroactively turned the original version into the performance. The sexuality thread gets addressed in this episode more directly than in any previous episode. The TV tropes recap and the TV line interview both confirm that Stewie discusses his sexuality during the therapy session. He tells Pritchfield he is not gay, then describes himself as fluid, then claims confidence in his heterosexuality while clearly being uncertain. The writer Janetti told TV Line that Stewie's awareness of his sexuality is this uncertain thing, and that needs to stay as it is. His uncertainty gives him vulnerability, which is something the show needs to maintain. That quote is the creative team saying out loud that Stewie's uncertainty about his identity is a resource they are managing rather than a story they are telling. The vulnerability is kept uncertain because uncertainty is useful. Resolution would close off material. The show chose the material over the character, as it always has with this particular thread. The episode builds toward a moment of genuine change. Stewie drops the accent. He considers letting his real self out into the world. He thinks about being honest with the people around him about who he actually is. And then Pritchfield says something that stops him. He suggests that dropping the persona would mean Stewie is just like everybody else. Stewie's response, documented by Newsweek, is immediate and total. He says, "I do not want to be like everybody else. I do not want to be like them, like any other zero in this miserable town, like my family." He puts the accent back on. The moment of potential change is over. What follows is the darkest thing the episode does. Pritchfield begins having a heart attack. He asks Stewie to hand him his heart medication. Stewie looks at the medication. He looks at Pritchfield. He understands that Pritchfield is the only person outside of Brian who has ever seen through his persona and found the real person underneath. He sits back and lets Pritchfield die. Not with violence, not with a weapon, just with stillness. He watches a man have a heart attack and does not help him because the man knew too much. The Screen Rant review of the episode is one of the most quoted responses to it. It notes that while it is a strong episode in isolation, its revelations will likely not carry forward into future episodes. That prediction was accurate. The Daily Beast interview with Janetti addresses this directly. He said he did not think the fake accent reveal should be revisited. He believed the moment was best left as a contained event rather than a story thread. His exact words were, "I think that is best left not revisited," which means the most honest and revealing episode about Stewie Griffin in the show's history was designed from the start to have no lasting effect on the character. The show looked directly at the damage and then sealed the room it was looking into. That sealing is the most telling thing about where Stewie was as a character by season 16. The show had the tools to change him. It had a brilliant episode, a great guest performance, a genuine emotional revelation, and a creative team that clearly understood what they had found when they dug into who Stewie really was. And it chose not to use any of those tools to move the character forward. Stewie woke up the morning after the therapy session, still using the fake accent, still keeping people at arm's length, still protecting himself from being seen. The episode had shown the audience everything and changed nothing. Brian sleeps in Stewie's bed at the end of the episode because Stewie wakes up screaming, troubled by what he let happen to Pritchfield. He tells Brian he has done something awful without saying what it was. Brian falls asleep. Stewie lies awake, disturbed. This ending, documented across the Wikipedia page and the TV Tropes recap, is the show's way of showing that the event had some effect on Stewie. He is not completely untouched by what he did, but the effect is private, unresolved, and deliberately kept vague. The audience knows what happened. Stewie knows what happened. Nobody else does. And by the next episode, the show had moved on entirely. Send in Stewie, Please is the closest the post-revival show ever came to doing something permanent and honest with Stewie Griffin. It found something true about the character that the years of road trips and sexuality gags and simulation two-parters had buried. It held it up to the light. It showed the audience what was underneath all the performance. And then it put everything back exactly where it had been and walked away. The character who had begun as a villain with a mission, who had gradually become a companion with a persona, was now confirmed to be something else entirely. A lonely child in a costume who had been pretending so long he had almost convinced himself the costume was real. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Almost. The part that was not convinced woke up screaming in the night. That part knew. But in a show built on resetting, knowing is not enough to change anything. The question that remained, heading into the later seasons, was where a character like this could possibly go next. The villain was gone. The persona had been exposed as fake. The friendship with Brian was the only real thing left. And the show was about to do something to that friendship that would test whether anything of the original Stewie could survive at all. Section 9. The Queer Identity Arc and Late Season Stewie. Seasons 17 to 23, 2019 to 2024. By the time Family Guy reached its 17th season, Stewie Griffin had been on television for 20 years. 20 years of the same character, technically, though the gap between the character who started the show and the character running through the later seasons had grown wide enough that calling them the same person required a significant amount of goodwill. The villain was gone. The vocabulary was gone. The matricide plots were gone. The simulation two-parter had closed the door on the central premise. The therapy episode had revealed that the accent and the persona were both constructed shields rather than real traits. What was left, going into the final stretch of seasons that would take the show into its mid-20s, was a baby who was funny and warm and deeply attached to his dog and had been gesturing at his own sexuality for 15 years without ever actually going anywhere with it. The later seasons made a decision about that sexuality thread. Not the decision to resolve it, because the show never made that decision, but a decision about which direction to lean. Collider's documented analysis of season 23, published in 2025, captures this clearly. It states that Stewie had gone from pure evil to a lovable, super intelligent baby, more focused on gags with Brian and exploring his queer identity. That phrase, exploring his queer identity, is the show's late-era framing for what Stewie is doing. Not resolving his identity, not arriving at an answer about who he is. Exploring, which is another word for the same permanent middle state the show had kept him in since season 4, just described with newer language that fit the cultural moment better. The Collider piece goes further and documents specific moments from season 23 that illustrate this direction. Stewie takes on the role of Iceman in a Top Gun-themed episode. He has a storyline involving a White Lotus-inspired adventure. He has a Christmas episode moment involving Meg. These are not villain storylines. They are not world domination storylines. They are the storylines of a character who has fully become the show's flamboyant, quick-witted, emotionally readable younger member, whose main comic energy comes from his personality and his relationship with Brian, rather than from any external mission or goal. The Wikipedia page for the list of Family Guy characters, in its current description of Stewie, reflects this completely. It describes him as a character whose storylines often center on his scientific inventions, time travel, and multiverse adventures, and his close, sometimes difficult friendship with the family dog, Brian. It then notes that his ambiguous sexuality is a recurring theme. This description would have been unrecognizable as a description of Stewie in season 1. In season 1, the description would have been a baby obsessed with killing his mother and taking over the world. The current official description of the character does not include either of those things. They are not even mentioned as historical context. The character the wiki describes is a different character wearing the same name. McFarlane's own public statements about Stewie's sexuality across this period are a document of contradictions that reveal the show's true relationship to this storyline. At various points, he has said Stewie is almost certainly gay. He has then said that as a cartoon character, Stewie can be neither straight nor gay. He has described Stewie as fluid. The Send in Stewie Please episode had Stewie describe himself as fluid while also claiming confidence in his heterosexuality. The TV Line interview with writer Gary Janetti after that episode stated directly that Stewie's uncertainty about his sexuality needs to stay as it is because
it gives him vulnerability that the show needs to maintain. Taken together, these statements confirm that the sexuality thread was never going to be resolved. The show needed the uncertainty more than it needed the story. The Collider piece acknowledges the fan complaints about these changes while also defending them.
It notes that many viewers voiced frustration with Family Guy's shifting tones, and that one of the biggest complaints revolves around the changes to Stewie's character. It then argues that shifting Stewie's arc was one of the best moves the show ever made, pointing to episodes like Christmas Guy, where Stewie travels back in time to save Brian after Brian is killed by a car, as evidence that the changed character could produce moments the original character never could. That argument is fair on its own terms. Christmas Guy is a good episode. The emotional weight of Stewie going back in time specifically to save Brian works because of everything the Road 2 series and the Brian and Stewie bottle episode built into their relationship. It is a moment only possible because of the transformation. But the Collider piece also notes something that cuts against its own argument without fully recognizing it. It observes that Stewie has one of the most satisfying arcs in Family Guy history thanks to the Season 6 two-parter. That arc, it says, saw Stewie go from wanting to kill Lois to protecting her and eventually caring about her. What the piece frames as a satisfying arc is, when described plainly, the story of a character losing his central defining trait and replacing it with its opposite. Going from wanting to kill someone to protecting them is not character growth in the traditional sense. It is character replacement. The show dressed the replacement up as growth because growth is what you want from a character over a long run. But the Stewie who protects Lois in Season 9's And Then There Were Fewer, shooting a sniper rifle to save her from Diane Simmons, is not a more developed version of the Stewie who spent Seasons 1 through 3 building weapons to use against her. He is a fundamentally different person who happens to share the same body. The TV tropes page for the Griffin family makes an observation about this period of the show that applies directly to Stewie. It notes that with the exception of Stewie and Meg, all of the family members became increasingly nastier after the third season. The exception for Stewie is telling. Most Family Guy characters moved toward worse versions of themselves as the show went on. Peter became more destructive, Brian became more self-righteous, Quagmire became darker, Stewie moved in the opposite direction. He became warmer, softer, more emotionally open, more interested in connection than in domination. The Villains wiki page for Stewie confirms this directly, noting that while many characters were made into darker versions of themselves as the series progressed, Stewie changed in a more positive manner, to the point of becoming an on and off anti-hero. An anti-hero. That is the official category the character eventually landed in. Not a villain, not even a former villain, an anti-hero, which in this context means someone who does things that are questionable or occasionally cruel, but who is ultimately on the side of the people around him rather than against them. Wizard magazine put the original Stewie on a list of the greatest villains of all time. The character that same Stewie became 20 seasons later was being described as an anti-hero with a queer identity and a best friend he loves enough to travel through time to save. Both of those characters produced good television. Only one of them was original. Only one of them was something that had not been done before, and that one had been gone for a very long time by the point the show reached its 20th season. The late seasons also produced moments where the show returned to Stewie's darker traits briefly, which the Collider piece points to as evidence that the character retained some of his original energy. The Send In Stewie Please episode, where he lets his therapist die to protect his secret, is one example. Season 23 episodes where he shows what the piece calls hints of his vindictive side are others. The Screen Rant piece on rewatching the pilot notes that as recently as Season 23, Episode 15, Stewie sadistically watched Brian destroy a toy, showing a brief return to his earlier cruelty. But these moments are described everywhere as exceptions, as surprising because they stand out from how Stewie normally behaves. When a character's original defining trait becomes a surprising exception rather than the rule, the transformation is complete. What the late seasons confirmed, taken together, is that the show had made its peace with losing the original Stewie, and decided the character it had built in his place was worth keeping. The queer identity thread would keep running without resolution. The Brian friendship would keep being the emotional center of his world. The scientific inventions and time machine adventures would keep providing plots. The occasional flash of cruelty would remind the audience that there had once been something darker there. And all of it would continue indefinitely, because Family Guy had been renewed through 2029, and the spin-off series Stewie had been ordered for 2 seasons, targeting the 2027 to 2028 television season. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing describing. It helps the channel tremendously. That spin-off is where the full story of what happened to Stewie Griffin becomes impossible to argue with, because the spin-off tells you, more clearly than any episode or interview or critical analysis, exactly what the original show lost and how permanent that loss turned out to be. Section 10. The spin-off and what it admits. 2026. Announcement. On March 12th, 2026, Fox and Hulu announced that they had ordered 2 full seasons of a new animated show called Stewie. Not Family Guy. Not a continuation of the main series under a different name. A separate show built around one character, centered entirely on Stewie Griffin. Premiering on Fox during the 2027 to 2028 television season, and streaming the next day on Hulu and internationally on Disney+. Seth MacFarlane is executive producing it. Kirker Butler, who has worked on Family Guy, is the showrunner. The show has already been greenlit. It is coming. The announcement was covered by Deadline, Variety, and multiple entertainment news outlets. The facts are confirmed and documented across all of them. The official description of the show, pulled directly from the materials released at announcement, describes the premise this way. After getting the boot from his old preschool, Stewie is forced to enroll in a new one that is not exactly top of the line. It is attended by a handful of kids he does not know and a 75-year-old class turtle with a half-cocked theory on just about every subject. Stewie is miserable, the other kids are miserable, and even the turtle is miserable, until Stewie begins rolling out his trusty array of devices to take them anywhere in space and time, turning every boring day at school into an insane and surreal adventure. Read that description carefully, not for what it says about the new show, but for what it says about the old one. Stewie is miserable. He does not fit in. He has devices that can take people anywhere in space and time. He uses those devices to turn ordinary situations into extraordinary ones. He is surrounded by people who cannot keep up with him, and a world that does not know what to do with him. This is not a new premise. This is the original premise of Stewie Griffin, the one that the main show spent 25 years quietly moving away from. The spin-off is going back to it. The Deadline piece on the announcement is where this is stated most directly. It notes that while later seasons of Family Guy tone down Stewie's evil, mother-hating personality, the spin-off offers a chance to harken back to the traits that made him an icon, and to some extent, the default mascot of Family Guy in the first place. That sentence is the entire argument of this essay, expressed in a single line from a trade publication. The spin-off is a chance to go back. Back implies that you left. If the main show had kept Stewie as the character he started as, there would be nothing to go back to. The fact that going back is part of the pitch for the spin-off is the most honest acknowledgement anyone connected to Family Guy has publicly made that the original character was lost somewhere along the way, and that losing him was significant enough to build a new show around recovering him. MacFarlane's statement at the announcement was delivered in what the Deadline piece describes as his signature deadpan style. He said, "I would like to thank Fox for this incredible opportunity, and I am excited to start pretending I am collaborating closely with them on the show." It is a funny line. It is also a deflection, which is characteristic of how MacFarlane tends to handle direct questions about the creative decisions made on Family Guy over the years. He makes a joke and moves on. But even through the joke, the existence of the spin-off says something he is not saying in words. He created a character in 1999 who was specific and original and genuinely unlike anything else on television. That character changed across 25 years into something warmer and more accessible and significantly less original. And now, in 2026, he is building a new show that promises to give audiences a version of that character closer to what they first fell in love with. Butler's statement was less deflective. He said he was honored and humbled that MacFarlane, the studio, and Fox had trusted him with one of the most iconic animated characters in the history of television. That framing, one of the most iconic animated characters in the history of television, is worth sitting with. The character being described as iconic is the original Stewie, the evil baby. The one-year-old villain with the British accent and the laser gun and the plans for world domination and the cold, precise hatred for his mother. That is the character people remember when they think of Stewie Griffin as an icon. Not the later Stewie who goes on road trips with Brian and explores his sexuality and cries in therapy. Those versions of Stewie are popular and have their fans. But the icon, the reason anyone cared enough about this character to greenlight a spin-off, is the one from seasons 1 through 3. The Sci-Fi Wire piece on the spin-off makes this connection even more directly. It describes Stewie as the matricidal obsessed infant with a genius-level intellect, inexplicable British accent, and tenuous plans to take over the world. It uses the present tense, not was, is, as if the character being described in that way is still the current version
of Stewie Griffin. But that version of Stewie has not been the current version for well over a decade. The Sci-Fi Wire description is describing the icon, the remembered character, the one that lives in cultural memory, the one the spin-off is being built around recovering. The spin-off will not affect what happens to Stewie in the main show. Deadline confirms this explicitly, noting that Stewie's preschool antics in the spin-off will be self-contained and not impact his stories on the main series. This means the two versions of the character will run simultaneously and separately. The main show Stewie will keep being the warm, Brian-attached, sexually ambiguous, late-era version. The spin-off Stewie will be the miserable, isolated, device-wielding, world that cannot contain him version. Two Stewies, one name, the same voice, different shows because the same show could not hold both of them at once. That split is the most honest thing the franchise has ever done about what happened to the character. By creating a spin-off that goes back to the original traits while leaving the main show free to continue with the evolved version, Fox and McFarlane are acknowledging something they have never said directly. They are acknowledging that there are two distinct versions of Stewie Griffin, and that they are different enough to support two different shows. If the main show had successfully evolved Stewie in a way that kept the essence of the original while adding new dimensions, there would be no need for a spin-off. You would not need to go back to something you never left. The spin-off exists because the main show left. And enough people noticed, and enough people missed what was gone, that a new show promising to bring it back was not just viable, but something Fox greenlit for 2 full seasons before a single episode had aired. The Variety piece on the announcement notes that Family Guy itself had been renewed for 4 more seasons as part of what the trade press called a mega deal with parent company Disney, taking the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season. The deals for Family Guy, The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and American Dad were all running through 2029. The spin-off Stewie was greenlit to sync up with those deals, meaning all 5 shows would be running under the same umbrella through the same endpoint. Stewie Griffin, the character who started as the most original and dangerous element of one show, will end up as the lead of his own show, running alongside the parent series for the foreseeable future. By any commercial measure, this is a success story. The character grew from a supporting villain into a franchise unto himself. But commercial success and creative integrity are different things, and the history documented across these 10 sections shows clearly that the commercial success came at the cost of the creative integrity. The original Stewie worked because he was specific, because he was committed,
because the show around him took his villainy seriously enough that every scene he was in had weight. That specificity was expensive to maintain. It required the show to be consistent in ways that the post-revival format was not built to sustain. So the specificity was traded for flexibility, the commitment was traded for ambiguity, and the weight was traded for warmth. The trades all made sense in the moment. They kept the character useful across a much longer run than the original version could have survived. They produced popular episodes and beloved storylines, and a relationship with Brian that stands as one of the best things the show ever built. And now there is a spin-off, a new show, built specifically to give audiences something that the main show stopped giving them somewhere between season 3 and season 9. The spin-off is not a creative failure. It might be genuinely great. It has the right people involved, and a premise that, on paper, sounds like exactly the kind of Stewie story that the main show walked away from. But the spin-off is also, whether anyone involved would phrase it this way or not, an admission. An admission that something was lost. An admission that the loss was real enough to be worth addressing. An admission that the character who made Wizard Magazine's list of the greatest villains of all time, who made an 8-year-old watching Saturday morning cartoons feel the specific thrill of a villain who meant every word he said, deserved better than what 20 years of commercial television did to him. The conclusion of this story is not that Family Guy ruined Stewie Griffin out of malice or carelessness. The show loved the character. In its way, it still does. But love is not the same as understanding. And understanding what made Stewie original would have required the show to protect something that was genuinely difficult to protect across a long run. It would have required resisting the pull toward warmth, toward accessibility,
toward the kind of character that audiences find easy to like. The original Stewie was not easy to like. He was fascinating. There is a difference, and the distance between those two things is exactly the distance between the character who started the show and the one now headlining his own spin-off in 2027. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.